this is the second half of the presentation, which I'll be giving today. I think John's done a good job. Before I start, should I guess tell you a little bit about where I fit into this story? I don't have a, I guess a horse in the race of, I don't, stress assess is not something that's in our organisation or our organisation promotes. We don't promote the guardian models at work either. My interest as an academic researcher is around, I've got an interest in trying to accurately measure the psychosocial work environment. So the different dimensions of the psychosocial work environment in the context of trying to understand how health impacts work and how work impacts health. And so from the perspective from the Institute for Work and Health, we're just interested in what is the best measure we could have if we had to do a survey of the psychosocial work environment in Canada. And in saying that, I have to commend OCAL for collecting this type of information. There's no collection of information at a provincial and national level around the psychosocial work environment. That's ongoing. A couple of Canadian community surveys which do it over 10 years, but there isn't any active collection of the psychosocial work environment, despite the fact that we keep hearing about how important it is. So, in terms of what I'll be talking about today, I'll start with, how can we measure things that we can't directly observe? So when we talk about the psychosocial work environment, things around social support, psychological demands, justice, these aren't things that we can measure like you can measure noise or dust. And so we talk about these things as sort of latent constructs or factors. We're going to talk about why Cronbach alpha is useless when it comes to assessing the quality of the multidimensional scale, a couple of examples. And then I'll also talk about the results of this sort of a correlation in a confirmatory factor analysis where we looked at the factor structure of the guardian models at work scale, and we also looked at the factor structure of the Copenhagen psychosocial questionnaire. So we talk about how we measure things we can't directly observe. So if I asked you to, you can't observe someone's sense of mastery. So if I said we're going to talk about sense of mastery, I've said in the construct of self-esteem, but sense of mastery is the construct we're looking at. If I said to you, well, someone's got a high sense of mastery, you'd probably be able to guess how they might answer the following questions, the following statements. How much they might agree. You said, well, you've got a little control over the things that happen to you. There's no way you can solve some of the problems that you have, or there's little, you can't do much to change many of the important things in your life. And so what we think about when we talk about latent constructs of these things we can't measure, if you think of the construct as this oval here, that oval has an influence on how we would respond to these questions. And so the questions, what we can observe, is we can observe the, yes?
Some people are having a little bit of difficulty hearing you. I wonder, could you put your microphone maybe a bit closer?
Sort of a headset.
Just maybe be conscious.
Louder?
Yeah, pretend you're on the stage conveying to a class or something like that. Is that?
Turn off your video?
Sorry.
Yeah, you could try turning off the video. I guess it might make it. It's just at the start of the sentences it's loud and then it's a little bit softer later.
Presentation. I'll try to speak up, but if people still have problems, if they can, this value can let me know and I can try and turn off my video.
Yeah, that's good. Okay, thanks. Okay.
So if we think about a construct, which is self-esteem, as I said, it will influence how we might respond to these things we can observe, which are each of these sort of items on the scale. And so what we'd want in each of the items that it'll pick up a little bit of the overall construct, which is self-esteem, and a little bit of unique information, because we don't want the items to be overlapping. Pick up the same types of information. We want them each to try and capture something unique. Now, when it comes to the psychosocial work environment, often we're not interested in just measuring just the one construct. We might want to measure two constructs. So here it becomes a little bit more challenging in that we might have our first construct, which might be something like social support, and a high level of social support would influence how we might respond to, say, items 1 through 5. Then we might have something else such as organisational demands, and that's going to influence how we might respond to items 6 through 10. What's important in this diagram is that we don't want social support, which is our construct 1, it shouldn't really be influencing how we respond to items 6 through 10. So you can see in this slide, there are no arrows going from the first construct to items 6, 7, 8, 9, or 10. And similarly, there are no items going from the second construct to items 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so what we're really trying to do with a multi-dimensional measure is we want some items to pick up levels of one construct, and we want other items to pick up the levels of another construct. We want them to be unique so that we can actually measure each of those particular constructs well. So, if we think about measuring on a multi-item, or when we measure more than one construct in a dimension, it's important that we can distinguish between the items that measure one construct from the items that are measuring other constructs. And the reason this is important is because if some dimensions are better or worse than other dimensions, we need to be able to pick this up. So we need to be able to distinguish between dimensions within an overall, a global psychosocial work environment. Because there might be things you want to target. I think Michael was saying at the start that often in organisations they might say, well, we can't target everything, so we can't target all 13 factors, or we can't target the 20 factors in the stress assist. And so let's think about the ones that we can target, maybe in the next couple of months, and then we'll move on to other ones. And if you can't measure those constructs independently or uniquely, then you won't know if you're successful in changing those things that you actually wanted to change at the start. And so, as I said, when we come to measure multi-dimensional environmental factors, it's important that we can distinguish between separate constructs within the overall instrument that we're talking about. And that's really at the heart behind confirmatory factor analysis and trying to understand correlations between items in scales.
Peter, can I just interrupt one more time? Tony's suggesting maybe turning off your video might make the sound. It has been better, but it just fluctuates a little bit. But you know how to just click the thing on the bottom of the screen or wherever we can't do it now that you're presenter. Only you can turn off the video.
Oh yeah, I can see it now.
It should be right beside your name in the participant list, or.
I can't see it.
It's harder when you're presenter, I appreciate. I'm sorry.
I'm going to stop sharing quickly. Oh no, hang on, I can see it.
Great. Thanks.
Off I go.
Okay.
All right. Sorry about that. So now I wanted to get into the bit that John alluded to before, just about why Cronbach alpha is kind of useless when it comes to multidimensional items and trying to understand if Cronbach alpha doesn't tell us whether a scale can actually measure different factors if they are present in the data. So this is some, it's not real data, it's data that sort of it's created just to illustrate this point. If you imagine that we've got 7 items on a scale. Now, in this case, we've got these 7 items that all map onto the one factor. So in this particular example, we have one factor. Each of the loadings, in terms of that factor, how they influence the item, is about 0.6. Each of the items have an item-to-item correlation of 0.36. If we were to run the Cronbach alpha on these 7 items, we'd get a Cronbach alpha of 0.80. We have a different situation, but now we have 2 different factors. So you can see the 7 items we have here, 7 items here. In terms of the item number 1 to 4, they've got a correlation, an item-to-item correlation of 0.85 between each of them, and items 5, 6, and 7 also have a item-to-item correlation of 0.85. There's no relationship between items 4 and items 5, 6, and 7. Similarly, there's no relationship between items 1 and items 5, 6, and 7. And conversely, there's no relationship between items 5, 6, and 7 and each of the other items 1, 2, 3, and 4. If I was to take these 7 items and run a Cronbach alpha, I'd get a Cronbach alpha of 0.80. It wouldn't tell me anything different than the first analysis did, even though in the second example, I've actually got 2 independent factors. Another example, might be where I've got two factors and they're related to each other. So there's two factors that have got a relationship here. There's strong associations between items 1 through 4. They've got an item-to-item correlation on average, which is 0.5. Same for items 5, 6, and 7, item-to-item correlation of 0.5. There's a weak relationship between items 1, 2, 3, 4 and items 5, 6, and 7, which is 0.25 higher, 0.25, sorry. Same as 5, 6, and 7 with items 1, 2, 3, and 4. If I was to run a Cronbach alpha on these 7 items, you've guessed it, it would be 0.80. So Cronbach alpha in and of itself tells you absolutely nothing about the factor structure within your items. And as John showed you before, he grabbed 5 items from 5 different factors in the Guardian Mind at Work survey and actually found a pretty reasonable alpha of 0.76. So I guess when you're evaluating a multidimensional scale, never stop with alpha. In fact, don't even start with it. So in terms of just reviewing the 2 measures of the psychosocial work environment that we're interested in today, there's the Guardian Mind at Work questionnaire, which has 66 items, 13 dimensions. All dimensions are affected by 5 items, 5 items in each dimension. Responses are on a 4-point agreement-disagreement scale. Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, which is 40 items, 17 dimensions, which is different to the 20 John spoke about before because in the factor analysis, I can't include a single, the dimensions that are only measured by 1 item. Dimensions are reflected by 2 or 3 items. The responses are on a 5-point scale. Some of them are about frequency, so how often does this happen? All the time, some of the time. Some are on amount, about the amount, so does this happen to a large extent, to a lesser extent? So first of all, we would look at the correlation structure. So when we're examining, how variables are related to each other, first thing we might do is say, well, what's the average item-to-item correlation between the items that are meant to be correlated with each other, which in this case would be 0.5 on the example I gave you before, and the items on the scale and the items which are not part of that dimension. So in this case, it would be 0.25. So if I was comparing the items on factor 1, I would find that the item within the scale is 0.5, and the relationship between those items to items which are not part of that dimension is 0.25. So the first thing we did was look at that for each of the 2 different scales that we were examining. So you can see here with the Guardian Minds at Work, the average correlation between the items within the dimensions is actually, it's slightly stronger, but it's quite similar to the correlation that it has with items outside of those dimensions. I'll add here that for these analyses and for the factor analysis, we used a Spearman correlation matrix. So there's different types of correlation matrices you could use. People generally don't want to use a Pearson when you've only got 4 or 5 categories. We've used a Spearman. Sometimes I might use a polychord correlation matrix. It's more, I guess, academic than useful, but if people are interested in that type of information, I know we do have some academic colleagues which are listening to the presentation, so just thought I'd mention that. But I think the main take home here is that the correlations between items within dimensions and between those items and other items outside of the dimensions tend to be quite similar. There is more separation for some dimensions, such as organizational culture. Actually, for psychological competencies, it's almost equal, or it is equal, slightly higher in terms of the relationship between the items within the scale and the items outside of the scale. And so this automatically makes you think, well, there's something about the relationship between the items here that they're quite highly correlated with each other, which is not what you'd expect if we have a group of items that are capturing 13 separate dimensions. If we look at the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, we can see a lot more separation between the items within the dimension and the items that are external to the dimension. Keep in mind, here we have fewer items within the dimension. We have more dimensions overall. But you can see, the closest we get here is around the vertical trust and organisational justice. But even there, we have quite a reasonable separation between 0.65 the items within those dimensions compared to 0.32 the items outside of those dimensions. And so, again, this is more reassuring that we think, well, if we are measuring all these different dimensions, we wouldn't want all the items to be correlated with each other. So just to sort of summarise it, in terms of, we examined in terms of the correlations of items outside of their dimensions. In the Guardian Mind at Work scale, we looked at just under 2,000 different correlations. 15 of them were at 0.7 and above. So that's 2 items on separate dimensions have a correlation of 0.7 and above, which is, you often don't get that with a test retest of the same item. And in terms of the ones that have had correlations of 0.6 to 0.69, there's about 7.8% or 152 of the correlations were between 0.6 to 0.69. And why are these guidelines important? Well, if something's got a correlation of about 0.6, it means that item is explaining about 36% of the variation up to almost 40% of the variation in the other item, which is not what you'd expect if the items are actually measuring separate constructs. For the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, there are no correlations that are above 0.7, and 13 or 1.7% in our sample had correlations which are 0.6 to 0.69. To give you some examples of some of the highly correlated items across dimensions in the Guardian Minds at Work survey, the first example, I've got 4 examples here. For the first one, in the involvement and influence dimension, there's an item which is, I'm informed of important changes that may impact how my work is done. In the clear leadership and expectations dimension, there's an item which is, I'm informed about important changes at work in a timely manner. So, you'd expect, given this question basically is the same, that they'd be highly correlated. But the problem here is that they're actually in different dimensions. So these items that look on the face of it to be quite similar are actually supposed to be reflecting different dimensions in the scale. The second example is about how a workplace effectively handles people problems that exist, which is an item under civility and respect. And then under organisational cultures, there's an item which is difficult situations at work are addressed effectively. Psychological protection, there's an item my supervisor cares about my emotional well-being. Under psychological and social support, whereas my supervisor would say, I'll do something helpful if I look distressed. And then under involvement and influence, there's an item which is I'm able to talk to my immediate supervisor about how I do my work. And under recognition and reward, there's an item which is my immediate supervisor appreciates my work. So these ones may be less redundant compared to the first 2 examples, but again, they're very highly correlated. And that's a problem when they're meant to be reflecting different dimensions on the scale. So in terms of confirmatory factor analysis, I don't know how many people are all that familiar with confirmatory factor analysis. I'll go through it in a fairly sort of overview in terms of what we want to try and find out in the confirmatory factor analysis. The first thing which sort of tells us about our measure's good at picking up multiple dimensions that the model converges. We did have a little bit of problems in terms of model convergence with the Guardian Mind at Work questionnaires because we kept getting an error about a positive definite matrix, which is a factor of the fact that which I'll get into, is that the dimensions are so highly correlated with each other, it's hard to get a good solution. The parameter estimates make sense. So this is where we expect the loadings between each dimension and the items that measure those dimensions to be high, at least 0.4 in a standardized sense, 0.4 and higher. I will tell you, I won't present that information, but I'll tell you on both scales that was the case, that the parameter estimates are high at 0.4 and above, both the Guardian Minds at Work scale and for the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. And then there's this thing about model goodness of fit statistics and if they meet the rules of thumb. And I want to focus on that today because that is actually what distinguishes a good measure from a not as good measure. So there's a variety of different goodness of fit statistics that are available. It's recommended that you use a variety. They're all based on trying to understand how well your model represents the covariance matrix that you have from the data. Again, I'll give you an example of that on the next slide. We talk about absolute fit, which is just can you reproduce the data in terms of the model, which is basically the chi-square statistic. The incremental fit and the parsimonious fit are both also based from the chi-square, but they look at it in different ways. The incremental fit is concerned where you you compare the competing models, so the model that you've used in terms of your data, and often a model where everything's uncorrelated. There's parsimonious fit, which is a trade-off between the parameters that you want to estimate and a better fitting model. So you think about a confirmatory factor analysis and you think about a correlation matrix. Generally when we measure a bunch of different things, everything's kind of related to everything else. It's very rare that we would find a zero correlation between two items. You could cheat your way through a confirmatory factor analysis and put a relationship between everything and then just remove one, and you'd get penalised on the parsimonious fit. So as I said, what you want to do is try and use all these different fit statistics to understand if you have a good model and it's reflecting if the data is supported with your theoretical model. And in this case, because both of these instruments actually have a theoretical model that supports them, so one for the guardian mind at work, we have 13 dimensions, which are meant to be captured by our 66 questions. The Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, we have 17 different dimensions that are meant to be captured by the questions that we use there. We can actually test each of those two theoretical models. Again, to put this sort of as a diagram, if you think about this box here, this is our correlation matrix, but the covariance matrix is just a standardized form of the correlation matrix. So here, what we want to do, and we have a proposed model here on the right-hand side of the screen, we can see in our correlation matrix, we have strong relationships between certain items that might relate to one factor, strong relationships between items 5, 6, and 7, which might relate to a second factor, and a weaker relationship between the items. And so we don't expect that factor 1 should influence how we respond to items 5, 6, and 7. We don't expect that factor 2 should influence how we respond to items 1, 2, 3, and 4. And so what we're trying to test here is, if this is our theoretical model, 2 factors, 4 items belong to one factor, 3 items belong to the other, is this supported by the data? And what we're trying to do in the confirmatory factor analysis is test whether that is the case. So some recommended goodness of fit indices. They're just rules of thumb. I should add that there aren't some absolute accepted agreeable things. For the confirmatory fit index, ideally 0.95 or higher, but certainly not below 0.90. Something below 0.90 would indicate a poor model, theoretical model in relation to the data. For the root mean squared error approximation, it's 0.5 and lower. Some people use an upper bound of 0.08. Usually that's for smaller sample sizes. But we'll go for today with the 0.5 and lower. In terms of the goodness of fit estimates for the initial models, both for the guarding mind at work, which is our first column here, the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, which is the third column here, and the rules of thumb, which are in the last column. For absolute fit, the chi-square statistic, neither measure meets the standard for that. The standard for the chi-square statistic is very sample dependent. It's very hard to get a good, to get a p-value which is above 0.05 for the chi-square statistic when you've got a sample of more than about 100 or 200 people. So generally we don't tend to put a lot of weight in that particular statistic. The standard root mean square residual, actually both scales look good in terms of that absolute fit indices, which again shows you the difference between the chi-square statistic and other absolute fit indices. In terms of the incremental fit, you can see there is quite a difference here between the guardian mind at work measure, which is both the incremental fit indices are below 0.9. The Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire is 0.94 and 0.93 in terms of the two fit indices I've got here. Ideally, we'd want those to be 0.95 and above, and we can make some modifications. Usually with the incremental fit, the way we improve that is either specifying relationships that we haven't specified or relaxing relationships that we have. And in terms of parsimony, you can see the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire performs a little bit better. It's below the 0.05, the root mean squared error approximation, with the guardian mind at work is not. We can do a couple of secondary models where we might, as I said, relax some of the covariances. We might correlate some errors within dimensions. There weren't many to be done in either measure. There was only 2 changes which were made, which is where you can see the degrees of freedom changes by 2. Modest improvements in both scales. Still, both of them look okay with absolute fit. Incremental fit is much better for the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire compared to the Guardian Mind at Work scale. And in terms of parsimony, again, better for the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire compared to the Guardian Mind at Work scale. So based on this, we would say the theoretical model is really not supported in our data. Our data doesn't support the 13 factors influencing the items that they're proposed to influence in terms of the Guardian Mind at Work scale, where there is evidence that it is the case in terms of the 17 factors we've examined in the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. In terms of challenges to improve model fit, in terms of the data that we've looked at, now keep in mind that we haven't had this data for very long. As John said in this slide, the data was collected on March 5th, 2020, so it's only about 2 months old. The Guardian Mind at Work scale, now the key issue here is the high correlations between items which are not on the same dimensions. So there's redundancy, there's a lot of cross-loading between items and dimensions, and really high correlation between dimensions. If you look at the correlations between so there's 78 correlations you can have between the 13 different dimensions if you relate each of them to each other. 18 of those are 0.95 and higher, which indicates that they're basically all measuring the same thing, which, as we indicated in terms of the similarity between questions that are meant to be measuring different dimensions is a real problem. So there's no way in the current scale to understand which dimensions are being measured by which items. And it's hard to make more specific suggestions for improvements because it's so highly correlated between the dimensions and between the items. We could get to an exploratory factor analysis and get a completely different theoretical model from what's been proposed. In terms of the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, there are high correlations between some measures. Vertical trust and organisational justice is 0.93. Lower but still relatively high correlations between predictability and rewards, which is 0.87. Quality of leadership and social support from supervisors, which is 0.86. There are some issues around commitment to the workplace, which is one of the dimensions in the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. It appears to be an outcome. So this particular dimension creates a few challenges in terms of model fit. In fact, when we remove the dimension and we model just the 16 dimensions without the commitment to the workplace, it actually improves the model fit a reasonable amount. And so it just shows that this commitment, if it is an outcome rather than a separate dimension, that might be something to think about in terms of how we figure out how the dimensions in the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire are related to each other. So just in terms of concluding comments, Guardian Minds at Work, it has poor model fit due to these items not reflecting the specific dimensions. The proposed dimensions are not distinct from each other as they should be. At this stage, preliminary results, I would suggest caution if you want to use this measure to capture specific dimensions or to monitor change in a specific dimension over time. As I said, I'm not convinced at the moment that the items that are proposed to belong to actual dimensions actually do reflect those dimensions well. In terms of the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, this is the second successful validation of the factor structure in the Canadian population. John spoke about the earlier paper we had done. So this is sort of the second successful validation. It would be good to examine if that holds, if the factor structure holds well for both the French and English speaking samples, which is yet to be done in terms of the second or even in the first study. Questions remain about the ordering of the dimensions within the overall measure. So one of the challenges is when you've got 20 dimensions, it's hard to know if some of the dimensions influence other dimensions. I know that Honey Berthelsen is on the line. I'd seen her before, and she's done some really, I think, important work about trying to think about which dimensions might influence other aspects when you think about it, because it's unlikely that they're all sort of just sit there, and there probably is some ordering into how some dimensions influence other dimensions. So I'll conclude by just, if people want to keep up with the evidence from the IWH, you can subscribe in multiple different ways. And for questions, I would say, please type in the chat box. If people have questions afterwards, they can feel free to email me. My email address is there. I will stop there. I'll stop sharing, and John's happy to answer any questions. Over to you, Val.
Great. It's a lot to absorb, but we really appreciate both of you taking the time to walk us through a level of analysis with which most of us, or at least many of us, are unfamiliar. And we are using the chat box right now if people have any questions. I guess you alluded at the end to why it matters, and I think you were referencing in terms of guarding minds, but even in terms of the two sort of challenges that you identified a little bit with the COPSOC too. But why does it matter, I guess, repeatability, or whether you've measured something and then you try to do an intervention and then measure again in order to determine whether you've made a difference? I think that's what you were sort of alluding to in the last slide, but that might not.
I think.
Go ahead.
I mean, if you think about it, John talked about before how often when you think about the psychosocial work environment in its entirety, you've got things like support, things like demands, justice. The interventions you do at a workplace level to improve those are going to be quite different. And so it's important, if you're doing something to improve the social support within your organisation, it's important that you can accurately measure social support over time. And so you don't want a measure where social support the questions that would measure that are all mixed up with the ones that measure demands and justice. And so, because you want to get a clear signal of what's happening to social support. We're trying to do something to improve that. We should try and isolate that dimension in terms of how we measure this stuff. And as I said, if you have items that don't really reflect that, or our social support items are actually in a different dimension completely, well, that's going to be a challenge in terms of measuring the changes in social support over time. And so, given that we might approach the different components of the psychosocial work environment in different ways, it's important that our measures can distinguish between those dimensions, both at one point in time and also over time.
Great, thanks, Peter. I see there's another question. One question is whether, curious if you've started to look into measurement invariance across the two Canadian language versions.
Yeah, so that is the next step, I think, in terms of the confirmatory factor analysis. So what we can do is we can actually move into understanding, so for the guardian ones at work, we're going to stop, because given the theoretical model doesn't hold, there's no point going further until the measure's improved, or until we can find a sample which confirms the theoretical structure of the measure. In terms of the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, yes, we do intend to look at that and understand whether the factor structure is similar for French and English speaking participants, if it's similar for men versus women, if it's similar across different age groups. I mean, that's all important stuff to try and understand if the theoretical model holds across different subgroups in the labour market.
Okay, great, thanks. Have either of you completed work with respect to other evaluation methods post-implementation of the CSA standard?
We have the paper that's been published. So in 2016, we did a survey, and the 2019 was a repeat of that. I'm not sure I fully understand the question. Maybe Peter?
In terms of, we haven't done, the Institute has not done any work with respect to evaluating. This is the first bit of work we've done in respect to evaluating the CSA standard for the psychosocial work environment. I know there have been other groups that have done some work on the usability of it in terms of across organisations, but we have not done much work on it. We've tended to focus a little bit more on the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire, just given there's a bit more of an evidence base behind it. This is some of the first work, as John had alluded to in his presentation, really some of the first work that's actually taken the measure available from the standard and tried to test the psychometric properties of it. And so, we'll be moving ahead with this and trying to publish it over the next few months.
Well, I think maybe I understand the question. If you're asking whether or not if we've used the survey in a workplace and then gone back and evaluated whether the intervention has been successful, we have used this survey in a number of workplaces repeatedly. And one of our presentations, I don't know which is planned, I'm not sure if they'll come to fruition, but will be a case study where these people have done the survey 3 times. And we measured a difference. Not the first 2 times, but the 3rd time there was quite an improvement. However, what role the questionnaire actually plays in the response to the questionnaire is a difficult thing to answer. It's a tool that can be used, but how it's used, there are a lot of variables that go into how it's used that are independent of the tool that you use.
Okay, thanks. There's another question. Has there been research into ISO 27500, the human-centered organization? I don't know if either one of you is familiar with that.
Nope.
So are there implications of this for the factors of the CSA factors, not necessarily the questions in the survey that try to tease those out? Like, are there, yeah, that's my question, I guess.
So I guess at the moment, from a factor analysis point of view, the poor fit could either be due to the fact that the dimensions are not independent, they're not different from each other, that there's a problem with the items that measure those dimensions, or both those factors. It's hard to say at this point. Certainly, from what we see in the current analysis, is that the dimensions as measured by these items are not distinct from each other, which means you could not distinguish between, something like, one dimension from another. They've been proposed as 13 separate dimensions. No one's saying they're meant to be independent. They certainly shouldn't have correlations of 0.95, which means that they're identical. So, and the same with the Copenhagen Psychosocial Questionnaire. No one's saying these have to be independent, but we should be able to measure them distinctly. And the current Guarding Minds at Work measure does not do that in this sample.
Okay, great. Thank you. Terry's making a few comments about lots of overlap means focus on broad stroke issues, which is hard to dig down to the specifics when there's so much overlap. And hopefully leading employers will want to get to the specifics, not simply the general info. We are almost finished. There was a request for your email addresses too, which we can provide in the chat, and also I think they're probably on both your slides, and we will post the slide decks with the videos. We'll probably get that up on Monday or Tuesday next week, and I will send an email. We will have a small evaluation, which we appreciate the participants completing to help us plan for the future and understand if this was interesting and also might make a difference to your work, because we are always trying to improve our impact. And before everyone leaves, I wanted to mention that this is the second in a series. First of all, I want to say thank you to John and Peter for all their hard work in doing this analysis, the level of analysis, and also in setting the stage, John, about the different approaches around the world, and then putting the deck together to share it with us, and to remind everyone that next week we do have Catherine Lapel, who John mentioned is a leader in this area and from University of Ottawa, and she's going to talk actually about the strengths and weaknesses of the use of law to protect worker mental health. And then Dr. Karen Harlos from University of Winnipeg is going to talk about research she's done on workplace bullying and its effects on mental health, and also some ways to influence that. And John's going to, he never gets a rest. He's going to pull out some of the data from the ECOS version of the COPSUC from 2019 to just give us a sense of, or the stress assess data actually, to give us a sense of the levels of bullying and harassment that were measured then, maybe even how that compares with 2016, and also how that correlates with symptoms and things like that. And then the final 2 weeks are not yet posted, but we do have Norma McCormick coming on the 22nd. So she'll be able to share information about the CSA standard, as well as the work that's going on ISO 45003, and we're excited about that. And then we hope to have some other content around survey success strategies, including qualitative analysis, and how hearing the voices of people as they fill out the surveys adds another dimension to being able to improve things in the workplace. And then on the 29th, John will be back again to present on our worker survey, which is a worker experience in pandemic. So it's not one of these, it's not the COPSUC survey, it's a survey developed by some of our labor partners, along with the healthcare worker survey that John shared last week, and which is linked on our website right now if people missed that last week. And WSPS, our colleagues and partners, are going to offer a webinar on protecting the mental health of employees who are working remotely, which affects many of us now. So thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you very much for our participants, and hopefully we'll see most of you next week. Take care.